as they say on an airplane, sit down, strap in, and I'm going to try and say some things that are relevant. And I think as a keynote speaker here in Tanzania, I bring a couple of advantages. One advantage is that I came to Tanzania in 1991. So I was exposed to Tanzania and its experience a long, long time ago in a very formative phase of my life, and really haven't kept up. So I don't know anything about the current conditions in Tanzania. So nothing I say can possibly offend anyone because I don't know anything about Tanzania. So I'm going to be able to present you with a framework for thinking about these issues in general. And it's up to you if you decide, does this help you think about your own experience in Tanzania or not? I'm not going to come and tell you about Tanzania. That would be ridiculous. I'm going to come and say, here's a framework that me and colleagues have been working on and research have been doing that we think helps in general create a vocabulary for discussing these issues. And we hope this vocabulary is useful to your experience, but I'm not going to begin to presume to tell you about your experience. The second advantage of the keynote speaker is that this is not my own work that I'm presenting. It's the work of myself and many other people, and sometimes I'll be explicit about that. But in a non-academic setting, I'm not going to be very careful about explaining where all the graphs and figures come from. But a lot of what I'm presenting is from other colleagues of the Kennedy School, in particular Ricardo Hausmann, who's been working on the question, essentially, of economic structural transformation in an interesting and new way. So I'm very happy that although Blandina was our student in 2000 till 2003, everything I will say is research that has been done since then, so it won't at all be redundant, because I'm sure she remembers everything we taught at the time. So there won't be any repeat because we're saying entirely new things. So what I'd like to do is go to three big concepts and then some implications of those concepts. And I think these are concepts that have a vocabulary around them that helps you think kind of more concretely about this question of the conference of the institutions and industrial-led growth. The first is, what are growth dynamics and why are they important? So in thinking about institutions and growth, I think it's very important to keep in mind what growth dynamics actually look like in the developing world. Second, as you've noticed, part of the title of my talk is The Difficult Growth Dynamics in a Deals World. Well, what is a deals world? What do I mean by a deals world, in particular contrast to a rules world? I think if you attempt to discuss kind of institutions in the absence of this distinction, I think you will go badly wrong. Then the third is understanding the process of structural transformation that leads to sustained growth. And finally, a few sort of implications of all of these about why, in fact, it is so difficult to sustain rapid growth. Turns out it's really not that hard to generate rapid growth. The trick is sustaining rapid growth over very extended periods. And that has proven, in fact, very difficult. So the first concept is growth dynamics. So I'm going to start with a question. And I see most of you have a pencil or pen. I want you to pull it out, and I want you to write down the answer to this question. And I want you to write it down because writing it down helps it make concrete for you. And plus, if I don't make you write it down, I trust you all, but you all lie afterwards and say that's exactly what you thought when I tell you the right answer. So I want you to write down the answer. And here's the question. Suppose that in 1903, you had just 11 years of data from 1890 to 1901, and somebody asks you to predict Denmark's GDP 100 years ahead with just those 11 years of data. The question is, how far off do you think your guess would be in absolute value? So positive or negative, are you going to be off by 100%? Are you going to be off by 50%? How far off are you going to be predicting 100 years ahead what the GDP per capita of this country is going to be with 11 years of data? You still have to write it down an answer. You can't just shake your head. You have to write down an answer. So everybody write down an answer. Or if you're really modern, put it into your cell phone. Okay. Has everybody written down an answer? Okay. I'm going to show you the graph of Denmark's GDP. And the dotted line is the trend line. The dark line is the actual evolution of GDP per capita. It turns out you would have been off by 3%. You would have predicted, inside the circle are both the actual and the predicted GDP from the simple extrapolation of growth from 1901 forward by 102 years. And you can't distinguish the two numbers. They're right on top of each other because you would predict it exactly right. That's amazing. This is truly one of the most amazing facts about the economic world, is you can predict it because, in fact, growth in Denmark has been just extraordinarily stable for a very long time. Growth has been 1.95% for 150 years, okay? So a lot of people that think about economic growth start with Denmark's experience in mind and then talk about things as if Denmark's experience is typical. Turns out, Denmark's experience is the complete opposite of the experience of most developing countries. And so attitudes and models and ideas that are formed on the basis to explain Denmark won't do you any good, because the experience of the developing world is almost exactly the opposite of the experience of the steady growth of Denmark. So in developing countries, economic growth is a condition, not a characteristic. What do I mean by the difference between a condition and a characteristic? Well, a characteristic is something that's stable, predictable. If it's true today, it'll be true tomorrow, it'll be true 10 years from now. So characteristics of me as a person, I'm male. I'll be male a year from now, I'll be male many years from now. I'm right-handed. I'm just right-handed. I'm not going to be left-handed. I'm short. I'm good-looking. Now, well, I'm going to say some things you might disagree with, but try and be polite at least. Whereas there are also other things that are true of me today, but which are conditions. They're not going to be true of me tomorrow or a week from now or a year from now, so I'm jet-lagged. Okay, I'm jet-lagged. Well, that's not a condition. You wouldn't predict because I'm jet-lagged today, I'm going to be jet-lagged a month from now or a year from now. I'm in a great mood because I'm in here in Tanzania in the Indian Ocean, but you can't predict I'll be in a great mood even an hour from now or a week from now. I have a cough. I have a cough, that's a condition. It's a temporary thing, it'll go away. So when we think of growth of developed countries, we think of growth as a characteristic. 2% growth was a characteristic of Denmark. It grew at 2% for a long time. But economic growth, rapid or not rapid, is a condition. Its growth is very volatile in developing countries and shifts enormously from one period to the next. So if we ask ourselves, is Brazil, and this is work that we've done where we've taken with some co-authors and we've decomposed the growth of every country in the world into episodes. Now, is Brazil a country with high growth or low growth? Well, it turns out both. Brazil had a period from 1967 to 1980 where it grew at over 5% per capita. I'm old enough to remember when people used the word like the Brazilian miracle to talk about Brazilian growth. But then, in 1980, as you see in this graph, suddenly, boom, economic growth comes to a complete stop, and from 1980 to 2002, growth was zero. Like 0% per capita for 22 years. So was Brazil a country with high growth or is Brazil a country with low growth? Well, the answer is Brazil is a country that doesn't have growth as a characteristic. It has growth as a condition and can experience episodes of very rapid growth and episodes of very slow growth. And nearly all developing countries are like Brazil. They have episodic growth, and episodic growth means countries move back and forth between very rapid growth, very slow growth, often periods of extended collapse in which GDP falls for 10 or 12 years, followed by long periods of growth. And these transitions of growth episodes are often phase transitions. They happen very fast. It's not like, again, if you look back at Brazil, it wasn't like there was a gradual slowing of growth. Growth just boom, poof, disappeared and then stayed away. And I'm sure, in the immediate aftermath of the slowdown, people thought economic growth was coming back very fast. Didn't come back for 22 years. So, so we should think about growth as experience a phase transition. Now, what do we mean by a phase transition? Well, the easiest example of a phase transition is, we have one going on right here in front of me, is water to ice, right? Water, when it's liquid, has certain characteristics, right? It behaves in a certain way. If I turn this glass upside down, we all know what's going to happen. The water is going to fall out. But at 0 degrees Celsius, water undergoes a phase transition, and it turns into ice. And once it's turned into ice, it has completely different behavior. You can't predict the behavior of water unless I tell you what phase it's in. And when it's in the phase of ice, I can throw water up and down, right? I can throw, and it's solid. It behaves in a completely different dynamic than when it's water. So rather than thinking growth as a process that's easily predictable and is always in some sense in the same phase, we want to think of growth as sometimes changing very rapidly, from being an episode of rapid growth in which certain things are possible to a period of very slow growth in which the whole dynamics of the economy fundamentally shift. So the question about economic growth is, how do you initiate and sustain episodes of rapid growth and avoid transitions into slow, stagnant growth? So that's kind of the way I would phrase the question. And once you recognize that growth is episodic, the first thing is that once you recognize that growth in developing countries is very rapidly changing and very episodic, the whole question of institutions starts to get more problematic than you might think. In the sense that this is a scatter plot that shows one measure of institutions, and I can do this with lots of different measures and the results are exactly the same. But one measure of institutions, say, is the quality of control of corruption. And what you see is that rich countries have good institutions and very poor countries have bad institutions. That's an interesting fact about the world. So it is the case that rich countries have less corruption. But if we say that isn't the same thing as saying growth dynamics are affected by corruption in the same way that the levels of growth are affected by corruption. So if you look at the bottom left diagram, that's the scatter plot between the rate at which countries are growing and the degree of corruption. There's very little correlation. It's not the case that countries with more corruption grow faster than countries with less corruption. And if we look at in the bottom right-hand side, it's the countries that changed the degree of control of corruption on economic growth, and countries that got better at controlling corruption didn't have faster growth than countries that didn't get better at controlling corruption. And fundamentally, this shouldn't be surprising, because one of the things about institutions, one of the things we mean in some sense by institutions, and by the way, you'll notice in all of my PowerPoint slides I have the word institutions in quotes, and that's because I still don't know what it means yet, and maybe that will come up today, what the hell an institution is, but we'll go with that. Institutions evolve very slowly, right? If this is the fundamental norms and rules of the game, or however you want to define it, usually that's something that evolves very slowly. And a fundamental principle that you learn when you take econometrics is you can't explain a squiggly thing with a smooth thing. So institutions evolve in a very smooth manner. Growth is very volatile. That means you can't explain accelerations and decelerations of growth in terms of changes of institutions, because they don't change enough over time, by and large, to explain the growth. So, which isn't to say we're going to get to a much more subtle and deeper understanding of that, but you can't explain the growth dynamics. Whoa, he's done with me. Okay. There we go. If they take this one away, I'm in big trouble. So you can't explain growth dynamics with institutional dynamics in a simple way, because one is a very slowly, smoothly evolving variable that looks a lot like a characteristic. Institutions tend to be more characteristic-like of countries, and growth tends to be condition-like. So we'll get back to that. So that's the first sort of thing, is that institutions might explain whether you're susceptible to episodes of stagnation, but not whether you're in higher growth or slow growth. Countries with weak institutions have rapid growth all the time. It's that countries with weak institutions, and we'll get to what we mean by that, are more susceptible to coming on to episodes of stagnation and episodes of retrogress. So, concept 2, and let's talk about deals versus rules. So I'm building up sort of conceptual frames so that we can have implications. The second is deals versus rules. It's, and the easy way to distinguish a deal situation from rules is, in a deals situation, what you expect to happen to you depends on you. Depends on who you are and what you've done outside of the rules in a fundamental way. So I can't predict what will happen to me just on a brute application of the facts to a rule. I have to predict it on who I am, what relationship I have to the actor, and what I've done to influence the action. So I lived in India for a very long time. And in India, if a policeman pulls you over, what will happen in that interaction depends, completely irrelevant is what the law is. It's completely irrelevant. What matters, what will happen, is the relationship you have and or the deal you cut with the policeman. Right? And again, I have the beauty of not knowing anything about Tanzania. I'm talking exclusive. Boy, I'm losing microphones one after the other here. I'm talking exclusively about India. But in that situation, it's a deals world. It wasn't a rules world. It didn't matter really what the rule was, right? It was what the deal. In contrast, in a rule situation, what happens to you does not depend on anything about you. It depends on what the rule was, and we apply the facts to the rules. So in the rules of chess, the queen can move in certain ways. The queen as a piece can move diagonally and laterally as far as she wants. But, in a rules situation, the Queen of England, when she plays chess, she's not the queen. The rules of chess are exactly the same for the Queen of England as for anybody else. So it's a rules situation, right? Same rules, doesn't matter. She's the Queen of England, but she's not the queen of the game, right? And she has to abide by exactly the same rules to play chess as everyone else. Now, fundamentally, now, I'm going to get a slightly more abstract, which is when we, a lot of times governments talk about policies and legislation and regulation. Let's think for a minute abstractly what all of those are. What those are is a way of mapping from facts about the world to actions by an agent. So what is a regulatory process? A regulatory process means some agent is authorized to come, so let's say it's environmental regulation. I'm authorized to come, I observe some fact about the world that might be the effluents of your plant, and if your pollutant effluents are greater than a certain amount, I'm endowed with the power to act as an agent of the state to fine you. And what the policy is, what the environmental policy is that mapping. A policy is a mapping from facts to actions by agents. Okay? Now, kind of around the world, it turns out policies don't matter a ton. Why? Because in lots of countries, there's no capability to implement the policy. So again, I'll go to an example from India. Some colleagues of mine did a study of how you get a driver's license in India. What they found was how you get a driver's license, and part of the law to get a driver's license in India said you have to demonstrate your ability to drive a car. That was the policy. Turns out the way you got a driver's license in India is you hired an agent who got the driver's license for you. And if you hired an agent, you didn't even need to go, much less actually take a driving test. So 95% of the people that hired an agent to facilitate getting a driver's license never took a driving test. So the policy of having the driving test as an integral part of getting a driver's license had no effect on the driving ability of people who had a driver's license in Delhi, India. In fact, they tested the people who had driver's licenses by getting an agent and getting their driver's license. 2/3 of them, like, literally couldn't drive a car. Like, they couldn't make the car move. They didn't even know enough about the car that the people who were hired to test their ability would get in the car with them because they were afraid they didn't know enough that they would crash, right? So we have to, if we think about policy, we have to think about the capability for policy implementation. Can we induce the agents to actually correctly assess the facts and then actually take the action dictated by the facts? If you don't have capability for policy implementation, the policy doesn't matter. So one field that Blandina mentioned I work on education. Every country in the world has a policy of universal education. Turns out, if you look across countries in Africa, the fraction of kids who can read once they've completed primary school varies from 3% to 97%. In some countries in Africa, having completed 6 years of education, everybody's illiterate. They can't read. In other countries, 100% can read. None of them have a policy of not teaching kids to read. They all have exactly the same policy. It's just some of them implement it, some of them don't. So capability for policy implementation, by and large, is the key to realization, not policy. You can have any policy you want, but unless you have the capability to implement it. Now, by and large, one of the things we mean by weak institutions, and again, I just can't stop my fingers from doing that when I use the word institutions. As I say the word institutions, just naturally my hands go up and I make this little symbol. So weak institutions, one of the things we mean is that we don't trust the capability for policy implementation. We don't think the policy actually predicts what will happen. So here I have another strange question for you, and I want you to write down the answer again. And the question is, have I, Lant Pritchett, been vaccinated for yellow fever? You heard a little bit about me. I've been all over the developing world. I've worked in various countries. Do you think I've been vaccinated for yellow fever? So write down an answer, yes or no. Come on, Benno. You got a lead here. You're going to be the discussant. Write down. I can see you. Come on. They haven't turned down the house lights or anything. Okay. Write down an answer, yes or no, and a certainty of 1 to 10. 1 is like, I have no idea. 10 is, yeah, I'm pretty sure he's been vaccinated. Okay, I'll give you time. You're not doing it. I can see you. Come on. No, right. Again, this is one of the things. This is a two-step thing. Has everybody written down their answer? Or has it in their head? Okay. Now I'm going to show you something. This is a scan of the UN yellow document that shows I've been vaccinated for yellow fever. Now I want you to answer, do you think I've been vaccinated for yellow fever? And I hope on the high-def screens you can see that this document says I was vaccinated for yellow fever in the Nairobi airport. Okay, how many people changed their mind on the basis of this document? Okay, in what way did you change your mind? You thought I had, and now I thought I didn't? This is a test of whether people actually understand development, actually. All my Western students change their mind and think I have when they see this. Pretty much everybody from the developing world, when they see this, they go, of course you weren't vaccinated for yellow fever in the Nairobi airport. So I have not been vaccinated for yellow fever, and yet I have been vaccinated for yellow fever. Meaning, I can take this document and go to any country in the world, and if they have a policy of not allowing people who haven't been vaccinated for yellow fever, I can get into their country. Because I have been vaccinated for yellow fever, but believe me, I haven't been vaccinated for yellow fever. Okay? So, if Just a simple illustration of what it's like to live in a deals world. With the agent of the health center in the Nairobi airport, we cut a deal. I needed a document that said I'd been vaccinated, didn't want a vaccination. He was in the mood to have a little bit more money than he had. We cut a mutually agreeable deal to all parties. But it completely undermined anybody attempting to enforce a policy of people not being vaccinated against yellow fever being in their country. Because, again, I can get into any country in the world with this document, even though none of you believe it, right? You'd still, if you were the customs authority, have to accept it, because legally, I have been. Okay. Now, it turns out, we by and large, in the developing world, sorry, I keep pushing this and not waiting long enough. Wait. Okay. So, one of the beautiful things about the World Bank, and I worked at the World Bank for many years and love the organization dearly, is it's too big to be consistent. It's too big to enforce too much orthodoxy. So one of the things the World Bank did is they go out and they measured how many days it takes you to get a construction permit according to the law. And it does this via the famous doing business things. And you can say, according to the law, if every firm followed the law, this is how many days it would take you to get a permit to build a warehouse. Well, the beauty of it is the World Bank, with its right hand went out and measured how long it would take you with the law, and with its left hand it went out and measured how long firms actually took. Now, you would think if compliance with the law were kind of the regular way the world worked, all of those black dots, which represent the legal value and the actual value, should fall on that 45-degree line. If you were following the law, it should take you about as many days to get a permit as the law says. What really happens? Nobody follows the law who actually builds a building. The median days to get a permit was about 30 days, even though the median legal time was 180 days. So, there's essentially zero correlation between what the law in your country says it will take you to get a construction permit and the time firms in your country actually report taking a construction permit. Roughly, at countries who the law is 90 days, they report about 30 days. If the law says 180 days, they report about 30 days. If the law says 380 days, they report about 30 days. The law doesn't change your behavior roughly at all. Moreover, it's worse than that. What this graph shows is for each country, since in the, whoa, did that go away? Okay, went away for me, did it go away for you? Okay, it's back, okay. In each country, since they asked a lot of firms how long it took, you could say there were fast firms and there were slow firms, right? And so in this graph, the circles are the fast firms and the triangles are the slow firms, meaning one of them is the 10th percentile of all firms that got a permit. How many days did it say? And so in Slovenia, right, the fast firms only took them 14 days to get a permit. The slow firms, it took them 365 days. Sounds like we've got somebody who tried to get a permit once. Meaning, kind of, if I was predicting how long will it take me to get a construction permit in Slovenia, the answer to the question is probably, who are you? It might take you a year. It might take you 2 weeks. Kind of depends who you are, right? And by the way, the variance within each country between the fast firms and the slow firms was enormously larger than the variance across countries. So across all countries in the world, particularly of the fast firms. So if you look at those dots, basically the law ranges from 50 days to 500 days, and for the fast firms, it's always a week or 2 weeks. So the law says it's 100 days, took me 2 weeks. Law says it's 200 days, took me 2 weeks. So kind of there's some firms that are living in a deals world. The law might say one thing, the reality of what I can do and I'm allowed to do and how I do it differs enormously. So, and by the way, This is a graph that if any of you understand it, you've looked at too many graphs and spent too long thinking about them. So you can't possibly understand it. It's meant to be like modern art that you like look at it and think, wow, that might mean something. But I'll tell you what it tells you. What it tells you is reducing the doing business value in 2/3 of the cases increases the time firm says it took them to get a permit, not decreases it. So really the doing business reform by and large is uncorrelated with reducing the actual time firms take. The essence of that is we mostly live in a deals world. For the most part, when you ask investors how they're forming their expectations of how they will be treated, they form their expectations based on the deal that they have been able to achieve vis-a-vis the regulatory environment rather than neutrally reading the law and assuming the law will apply in a neutral way to them. And around the world, there's sayings. In Latin America, there's a saying, for my friends, anything. For my enemies, the law. Because after all, if the law says it takes 365 days, I don't have to punish you to delay your factory. I just have to enforce the law. And to reward my friend, I just have to let him accelerate relative to the law. In India, I have many friends who work in the Indian bureaucracy. They have a saying. When I ask them, I remember asking one of them, well, what's the rule about this? And they said, you show me the face, I'll show you the rule. Meaning it was flexible what the rule was. It depended on who it was. So now in a deals world, so one of the things we might mean by weak institutions is that we're living in a deals world. And in a deals world, the rules of the game is that there are no rules. Right? We keep using the phrase rules of the game. Right? There's no rules of the game. There's no rules of the game in the sense that there's these neutral rules of chess that everyone who plays chess has to abide. The answer to the question, what are the rules of the game, is it depends. It depends on what you're willing to do. It depends on who you're willing to pay. It depends on who you know. Right? So in weak institutions, you can't predict what will happen to you merely by knowing the rules. You have to know what deal is available to you. And we want to classify deals. It's not just that, therefore, the deals world is homogeneous and it's always chaotic. In fact, there's different types of deals, and I want to classify deals into 4 categories based on these 2 simple distinctions. One is are the deals open or closed? Open means kind of everybody can get the deal. So with respect to how you are treated when you're at a traffic stop in India, it's an open deal. Everybody can negotiate with the policeman on roughly the same grounds, and roughly you all pay about the same amount. Probably slightly more depending on how expensive your car is, but about the same amount. A closed deal basically means for any given sector or deal that's available, I know by last name or first name who the deal is available to. If you ask me, who is going to build a hotel in Mubarak's Egypt? I can tell you the last names of everybody who might build a hotel in Mubarak's Egypt. It's not like there's 1,000 people that might do it and it just depends on the market. It depends on who knows Mubarak, full stop. So closed deals mean the deal is only available to certain actors, right? The second distinction of deals is whether they're ordered or disordered. And ordered and disordered just means if you make the deal, does the deal stay done? Does it create predictability? Because one of the issues that I'm raising is that predictability can be created by deals. We're assuming that rules, there's some assumption that rules are the only way to create predictability. That's just not true. A deal can create enormous predictability as long as it's an ordered deal, right? So now the second class, so I just want to keep that in mind because, again, when people say you need good institutions, the assumption is that you're going to create predictability of investor expectations around rules and neutral enforcement of those rules via strong organizations with high capability. That's one way to do it. But no developing country actually does it that way. Most developing countries create predictable investor expectations on the basis of ordered deals. And as we'll get back to in a second, ordered deals have in fact been the source of most of the rapid growth episodes you observe in the developing world, not any transition to good institutions, per se, of the rules type. The second distinction I want to make is a market matrix, because the deals environment of open, closed, ordered, disordered isn't an economy-wide thing. It usually applies to specific sectors. And different sectors can have different types of deals. And this is a market matrix of whether the sector is high rent or competitive, and whether the sector is export-oriented or oriented to the domestic market. And we call the actors in those different sectors of the economy different things. So naturally we called export-oriented high-rent sectors, those are rentiers. That's oil, that's mining, that's natural resources, right? You cut a deal, and that deal is basically about extracting a natural resource that's for export, and there's nearly always some rents to be had from that. Domestic market high-rent sectors we call the power brokers. These are the people that, and this example was done for Liberia, these are the people that dominate the non-tradable industries in an economy. So often if you want to know who really has power in an economy, you look who can get construction contracts. Who's getting the big construction contracts? Nearly always, and I don't know anything about Tanzania, nothing at all. Nearly always, if I know who gets the big construction contracts, I know who is deeply embedded in the deals environment in that country. So we'll call those the power brokers. Then we have the magicians, the people who are exporting things, but aren't rent sectors. And by the way, that's all of industrial exports, right? You can't have rents in industrial exports because you can't make foreigners buy stuff. So there's no rents in selling shoes and shirts and cars and stuff because foreigners can buy them from other countries. We call these magicians. And then finally, in the competitive domestic market, there's the workhorses. The small-scale sector, if you drive down Bagamoyo Road, it's lined with the workhorses. People who don't have any special access and just set up their tables on the side of the road and sell what they can sell to make what income they can make. All of these four actors operate in very different rules environments. So, that's the second concept of deals versus rules. I'm going to go to the third concept. And the third concept is the economics of product complexity and structural transformation. And this all basically is work done by my colleague Ricardo Hausmann. These are all his slides. I'm merely conveying them to you. This is work that Ricardo Hausmann at Harvard Kennedy School has done with a variety of dozen co-authors over the years. But his fundamental idea is that we think that rich countries are rich because they produce more than poor countries. And that's not really true. The difference between rich countries and poor countries is they produce different stuff. They produce a whole range of products that poor countries don't produce at all. So some things they produce more of, but lots of things, rich countries are just fundamentally able to produce lots more things than poor countries are able to produce. So if you look, his fundamental metaphor for economic development is like a game of Scrabble. Game of Scrabble is a game where you draw out letters from a bag and then you try and form words. Right? Now the thing of forming words from letters is that to form a word you have to have all the letters. Right? You can't like, oh well, I have two letters. If you only have one letter, you can only form one word at most. Right? If you only have three letters, these particular three letters, then you can make four words. Okay? If you start to get more letters, I don't know where to point this thing to make it move. With four letters, adding an R to those letters, we can go from just only 4 words to 9 words. And what you're seeing is that as we add letters, the number of words that become possible increases exponentially. So by the time we have 10 letters, we can make hundreds of words. Okay? So what's the metaphor? The fundamental metaphor is economies. Think of a letter as being a capability economy possesses. It's something that the economy is able to do. But products are combinations of capabilities. In order to make this product, I need to be able to do this and this, just two things. To make this product, I need to be able to do this, 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 and this. I need to be able to do 4 things. The more things you need to be able to do, the more complex the product is, the harder it is for an economy to be able to put together in one place at the same time all the required capabilities. So in this theory, the process of development is the process of economies acquiring a greater and greater number of capabilities that enables them to produce more and more products, each product of which has a very specific recipe. It's like a word. There's only one way to, well, only one right way usually to spell any given word, right? And so, now what that means is that what the rich countries do, this is a graph that shows, if we look at countries' export structure, this shows the number of products they actually export, and it shows the product's ubiquity, which is how many other countries are also exporting that product. The characteristic of rich countries is that they export lots of different things. Again, you might have thought, theory of comparative advantage, the rich countries export a few things, but they're more complicated things. That's actually not how it works. What happens is if we look out here at Japan and the United States and Austria, they export thousands of goods, and many of the goods they export aren't exported or only exported by few other countries. Why? Because complicated products require lots and lots of capabilities, and only very few countries have all the capabilities it takes to export that product. Poor countries, which are located up here, export very few products, and the products they export are exported by lots of other people. Why? Well, because if you only have a few capabilities, you could only make a few words, but it turns out lots of other countries have those same capabilities and can make the same word. So you're competing in a market where everybody can make the word you can make. That's not a very happy situation. So, turns out if we calculate economic complexity based on the diversity and ubiquity, how common the products are of a country's product structure. Let's see if I can get synced with my slides. I can't tell whether I'm controlling the slide or he can. What? Speaking of capabilities. Okay. So it turns out your level of GDP per capita is very well predicted by the economic complexity of your export structure. Basically, if you have an export structure that has very few products, and the products you have are mostly products that other people are also able to produce, you tend to be a very poor country. And these are the resource-rich countries, which tend to be rich by exporting oil. So in all of the non-natural resource exporters, basically all of the rich countries have a very complex export structure, and all of the poor countries have a very simple export structure. And in this slide, Tanzania is circled. So Tanzania, at least as of the year of this slide, had low economic complexity and low GDP per capita. So now, I've got to point this at the right place and then be patient. Now, the thing about export structure is that it actually gives us guide to what we need to do to sort of promote industrialization, which is some products tend to be exported together and other products not. So kind of everybody, this is the correlation between countries that export women's shirts and countries that export women's suits. So by and large, if you can export a woman's shirt, you can export a woman's suit, which means there's a very high correlation. Whereas between cocoa beans and aircraft, there's almost no correlation. Being able to export cocoa beans doesn't mean anything about whether you're going to export aircraft. Which means goods cluster together. Why do they cluster together? Because they have similar capabilities. So products, just like some words are almost like other words in that they share almost all the same letters, some products share almost all the same capabilities and hence tend to move together. Other ones have completely different capabilities and hence there's no correlation. And you can form the product space. This is a graph of what the world's export structure looks like that says these kinds of goods tend to cluster together. So this is a cluster of textiles. This is a cluster of machinery. Out at the periphery of this are often natural resource products. They don't cluster with anything. Now, the process of economic development basically looks like, if we look at what a given country looks like by having, we color their node if they're capable, if they're exporting that product, this is what a country like Venezuela that exports almost exclusively oil looks like. It doesn't have any export capability in any of the major clusters of the product space. They can't do anything that has lots of near neighbors, right? Whereas if we look at the country that also exports oil, but is not oil dependent, do I need to speed up? How many? Okay, yeah. Okay. If we look at Mexico, Mexico has penetrated the export space, right? So if we look at the structure of exports of Venezuela, it's nearly all crude petroleum. If we look at Mexico, Mexico has this enormously varied export structure. So if we compare Thailand to Ghana, what you see is that they started off in 1965, mostly located in the periphery of the product space. But what happened is by 1980, Thailand was solidly into garments. Ghana hadn't made any penetration. If we look by 2010, Thailand was doing essentially everything. They had some major exports in nearly every component of the product space, whereas Ghana was still almost exclusively limited to the very periphery of the product space. So, which meant, if you look at exports per capita in Ghana were lower in 2010 than they were in 1965 because they hadn't successfully diversified. Thailand's were, I forget the number, but just enormously larger because they had penetrated into more and more of the product space. So, the implication of this is that sustained economic growth requires increasing product complexity, and products require long lists of specific inputs. Therefore, in order to have industrial-led development, you have to have an increasingly complex array of public and private inputs available. Okay. Let's review what we've done. What I've been trying to do is create a new vocabulary for talking about this issue that's very different than the old vocabulary that has dominated a lot of the economic structure. The first is that I want to emphasize growth dynamics with episodes and rapid phase transitions, whereas the old approach to economic growth often treated as if it were linear and it were on a thermostat, and if you did slightly more of this, you got slightly more growth. If you did slightly less of that, you got slightly less growth. That's not the way to think about growth. The way to think about growth is getting and staying in an episode of rapid growth. The second is that I think the old approach tends to think countries differ by the rules they have. My argument is most countries are actually characterized by the deals they have, and very few countries actually have a close convergence between their rules and their deals. And the deal structure is what actually determines the performance that's available to you at any given time. And finally, in the new approach, we have an economics of product complexity, which emphasizes that economic development is producing more and different types of goods, each of which requires different capabilities. Whereas the old approach, if you learned about economic growth, you learned about, well, we produced more by having more of these broad aggregates, more skilled labor, more capital, more technology. So I'm just trying to create, in some way, a new conceptual vocabulary to actually describe the reality of a complex world. So growth dynamics, deals versus rules, and the economics of product complexity are introducing a vocabulary to discuss the realities that confront trying to do policy making starting from a weak institutional environment, right? And it's sort of like, imagine trying to describe music if you don't have the concepts and vocabulary to describe rhythms, beat, melodies, harmonies. We would just say, oh, that sounds cool, and we would be at a level of granularity that wouldn't actually help us with the discussion. So I'm going to stop there because we've been at it for a very long time, and thank you very much.